friends, just got back from New York from the press event that Sony put on. Obviously, they flew me out there. I was there for about 48 hours, and about 24 of those 48 hours were spent walking around the city, doing some tests, hanging out with other YouTubers whose videos you'll probably see, and whose faces will probably appear at times in this video as well. But it gave me at least a quick little glimpse into the new Sony Alpha 1 Mark II, and I have a lot of thoughts about it, both good, and we'll talk about the bad, but mostly I want to talk about where I think this camera sort of places in the market and who this camera is for, right? So I'm not going to go over every single spec, but I'm going to hit the ones at least that are most interesting to me at least. And to be honest, between the two products that they released at the event, the A1 Mark II is amazing and really, really cool, but I'm definitely much more interested, for me personally, and I think that is going to be a much more usable tool for me, is that 28-70, which I reviewed up here if you're interested. Having a 28-70 at f2 is going to be fantastic, and I'm definitely going to get that lens as soon as it comes out. That being said, the fact that the original Alpha 1 came out with these generally same specs in 2021 is one of those instances where it feels like they kind of like outkicked their coverage. So in football, what happens sometimes is it's called outkicking your coverage, where the punter will kick it too far. It'll be like too, not necessarily good of a kick, but it'll be too far, so far that when the team goes down to tackle the person catching the football later, they're too far away. It's like too beyond what the expectations were. And so it almost feels like that was the Alpha 1. In 2021, they put out a camera that in today's specs is still impressive. So if the Alpha 1 didn't exist in 2021, and then they came out with all of these same specs, this same sensor, all of this kind of stuff, in that vacuum, this is an incredibly impressive camera release. But the problem is, again, they outkicked their coverage. So they did all that 3 years ago, and now 3 years later, I think a lot of people were looking for more of a bump in specs, something else beyond what they kind of did, which oddly is kind of similar to what they did with the A7R5. The A7R5 shares the same sensor as the A7R4, but they added a lot of ergonomic improvements. They added AI autofocusing functionality, a bunch of things like that ended up making this a more interesting camera. And for me, I was never going to buy the A7R4, but I did buy the A7R5, and a quick spoiler, do think this is the best camera for the vast majority of photographers that want a high-end camera. So let's get into some of these specs. What is going on in the Alpha 1, which now shares the same body as the A9 III. They have a lot of really good ergonomic improvements, and I brought my A9 III to New York to do my testing. It has been my favorite hybrid photo video camera because the video out of this is really, really good. And then obviously the photos out of it are just like bonkers. But using them side by side, obviously it's like the exact same body. The literal only difference here is going to be right in this spot where it says A9 III and right in the front where it says A9 instead of A1. And a quick little like micro nitpick side note here. One of the things that was kind of like cool and set the Alpha 1 apart was the fact that the logos here were gold on the original Alpha 1, sort of pretentious or whatever, but it was cool because these ones all on the regular line are in a like silver, and then the R here is like an orange color, but it made that like Alpha 1 feel like slightly more prestigious. And now if you can see just this little difference here, the A is in white, and the 9 is just like, it doesn't even have like anything surrounding it or anything, kind of minimal. And I thought like, oh, for a sports camera, that's fine. But it is sort of silly. I was kind of anticipating these two things on the Alpha 1 being gold again, which just like, is that like, this is the flagship, this is the big thing. So not even something that I'm like upset about or anything, obviously. But it was one of those things where I thought it was a little bit interesting that they didn't distinguish it even that tiny little bit more from a model like the A9 Mark III. Now here again is where these features in 2024 into 2025 are still very, very impressive. we have a 50.1 megapixel stacked CMOS sensor that is incredibly fast. So one of the things that I started to look up once I was going through this is, okay, how fast are these readout speeds? Because one of the things I realized was that it does 30 raw photos per second, but that is using the electronic shutter. And I have the two kind of polar opposites here in the Sony line, where I have a global shutter with, just instant readouts, and then the A7R5, which has an incredibly slow shutter. And one of the things that happens with this camera, if you're doing any movement or anything, the rolling shutter is just like horrendous. But I've had plenty of times where photographers will say that they've used the A7R5 in the electronic shutter mode for like ceremonies or something, and that is definitely not something I recommend on this camera, because if you have any movement at all, you're going to run into significantly poor rolling shutter. So the Alpha 1 though has such fast readout speeds that you can still use it. So to put it in perspective, the electronic shutter readout on the Alpha 1 is only 0.3 of a millisecond slower than the mechanical shutter readout on the A7R5. So all that being said, you can absolutely use the Alpha 1 in electronic shutter without having any real worries about rolling shutter or anything. It's only going to be at the like most peak kind of thing like that. Like if someone's like hitting a golf ball or the swing or a baseball, are you ever going to have something that is going to be any bit of an issue between those things? So speaking of that rolling shutter, one of those things that is just wild is that this is a 50 megapixel sensor, and the readout, even in video, is actually faster than the A7S III, faster than the FX3, faster than the FX6, all those cameras. And it's actually only 0.2 of a millisecond slower than an Arri Alexa Mini LF, the standard video camera that, like big Hollywood blockbuster movies are made on. So if you're really wanting to get like an A9 III because you're like, oh, the rolling shutter performance isn't gonna be as good, this obviously has no rolling shutter at all. The movies that you're seeing aren't even filmed on cameras that are much faster than the Alpha 1 is in the first place. So it's actually wild and something that I had never realized, that the video performance in terms of rolling shutter is even better than my Sony FX3. Now, in addition to the body, it also grabbed a few other things from the Alpha 9 Mark III. The first of which being the AI processing that came first in the A7R5. And it's one of those things where the more that I've described Sony's autofocus, it's not necessarily faster, because all the lenses and everything are fast enough. There's zero issues with that. It's more that it's just so much smarter now. It's mostly just getting us exactly what I'm looking for. And for me, the nice thing, if you are doing sports or even doing weddings like I do, if I want to lock onto a person and they walk behind another person, it has these AI pose estimation and things like that. So it's guessing inside of those processors where that person most likely will end up, and can track them through different things. If someone walks in front of them, if they walk behind something else, all that kind of stuff. For the most part, it just does like a fantastic, incredible job. And it makes my job in focusing so much easier. Again, one of the things that the original Alpha 1 had was this tilt screen. The new one has the fully articulating screen and the tilt screen here. It's this 4-axis thing, which first came out on the A7R5. Now, obviously, the Alpha 1 Mark II gets that as well, because it's included on the body of the A9 Mark III. And you just get all the best tech that Sony has to throw at it, right? So you get their viewfinder, you get the screen, you get the pre-capture, you get this front little burst button if that's something you're interested in as well. Just everything they've got, they throw the kitchen sink at basically every camera that they put out these days. So if you want like crazy ultimate speed, that's where you can have the A9 III, but the A1II has a lot of incredible speed. If you want resolution, high dynamic range, a lot of the things that I want as a photographer, you mostly get almost all that same stuff in the Alpha 1 Mark II as well. The only thing you're missing out on is like 11 megapixels of resolution. But once you're like up over, 45, 50, you're into 60, you're already in the plenty of resolution category. And I will say that the kind of best thing about this camera is the fact that it has that high resolution sensor as well as the high dynamic range. And then the little kind of party trick is this basically has a 26 megapixel APS-C camera inside of it, and the Alpha 1 Mark II gives you essentially another just slightly lower resolution. I think it's still in the 20s megapixel APS-C camera inside of it as well. So if you are someone that likes to crop in on your images or extend your lenses a little bit by using the APS-C crop mode, it's definitely something you can do as well in the Alpha 1 Mark II. So to be honest, the camera is fantastic. If you were going to put down my ideal dream mirrorless camera, it would pretty much be the Alpha 1 Mark II. It has a high enough resolution sensor. It has some of the best dynamic range, if not the best dynamic range that Sony puts into their stuff. It has great image processing, giving you clean files even at high ISOs. It also is an incredible video camera, technically even better than my Sony FX3 in every aspect, except for, I guess, ergonomics and that high ISO. But obviously all of that comes at a cost, and that cost is $6,500, which obviously for the vast majority of people is going to then price them out of something like that. All that being said, it's a flagship camera. The vast majority of people aren't supposed to buy it. Even the vast majority of people that are doing wedding photography, it's overkill for wedding photographers. If you're just doing wedding photography, this is the camera I recommend. Buy an A7R5. It's a fantastic camera. For the way that I photograph things and everything, like this is a probably even slightly better camera than the Alpha 1 Mark II. Now, there are going to be a subset of people that the Alpha 9 Mark III works better for. Obviously, high-end sports photography, some other photojournalism things where image quality in terms of like dynamic range isn't not as important as full-on, speed, and having 120 photos per second is just absurd on this thing. There's a ton of reasons why this is fantastic. And there are those photographers that do a lot of off-camera flash work, which makes this fantastic because you can flash sync at any shutter speed. That's definitely going to be very useful for some people. So all that to say, I am probably a small subset of people that the Alpha 1 Mark II does make some sense for. I do a lot of both high-end photo stuff and high-end video stuff. I do both at the same time, which is one of the things that the A9 III has been really useful for me for. But the fact that the Alpha 1 gives you 30 frames a second, I can do very similar things with that camera as well. And one of the things I'm most interested in my work is having enough resolution to crop if I need to in quick scenarios where I'm doing wedding stuff, but also to be able to maximize the dynamic range in a lot of the scenarios that I'm in. So that's why I lean on the A7R5 quite a bit. But having another camera that I can also do video for and everything like that makes a lot of sense to me. But to be honest, is still a fairly hard sell as someone who has an A7R5 and an FX3 already. And if you've added those two things up, you can almost get, or you can probably actually totally get a used A7R5 and a used FX3 for less than an Alpha 1. Now, I'll also say that the original Alpha 1, they have brought that price down by $1,000. So if you do want all of those specs and you are mostly a photographer that doesn't necessarily need all of those new AI focusing features, that camera might be a really good use case for you. I will say though that between the AI autofocus features and just the new body design itself, having this tilt screen and having a few of the other improvements like IBIS, as someone who does a lot of video handheld, a lot of those things are going to be worth that $1,000 upgrade. The difference between $5,500 and $6,500 still is a ton of money, but at that point, I do think that it's worth that upgrade, right? So whether or not I'm going to purchase this camera, it's mostly down to whether or not I want to use the features of this camera versus a lot of the other features of the Alpha 1 that I sort of get on some other cameras and still get on this one as well. And for most working professionals, I'm gonna be honest, like the A7R5 is still going to be the camera that I think gives you the best bang for your buck in terms of if you're going to go for one of the pro level cameras. You get the amazing viewfinder, you get the screen, you get these files that are amazing. And so it's hard for me in my wedding portrait-y kind of world to recommend a camera that is thousands of dollars more than this one. But if you are a photographer that has the budget for one and has a set of different mediums that require all of these different things, I think it's a fantastic camera. Flagship cameras are not made to be the thing that most people get. The other subset cameras are. But if you want one camera that is kind of just the giant amalgamation of every other camera that Sony makes, I do think the Alpha 1 is a great flagship camera and makes a ton of sense. So ultimately, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. If you're interested in my video comparing the two of these, you can check that out up here. Check out my video on the slightly more exciting, to me at least, 28-70 f2 up here, and I will see you in one of those videos.